The degree of autonomy and self-determination we have in podcasting is staggering, but we can get caught up in the rest of podcasting and overlook others struggling to find the freedom we enjoy. Hello and welcome to another podcast Pontifications with me, Evo Terra. I sometimes forget how empowering podcasting can be. I mean, I know that it is, but I tend to forget about empowerment as a primary motivation for podcasting. You see, people podcast for lots of reasons. You podcast maybe for lots of different reasons. Some people podcast to make a pile of money, be a big pile or a small pile. Hope springs eternal for this particular bunch. And a lot of these would-be podcast millionaires give up when they realize that the road to riches is, unpaved, uncharted, complicated, and time-consuming. Some do it as a job. I mean, working in podcasting or working on a podcast. There's a slightly better chance of those people actually making some money from podcasting. But still, it's filled with uncertainty. Some of us do it as art. Not me, but some podcasters do this as art because creating things is at their very core. And audio is a beautiful medium to work within. Some podcast for fun. I mean, pure as simple. Not much other motivation beyond that. They don't have any, or at least very few, hang-ups or expectations other than this is something to have fun with. Honestly, this is how I got started in podcasting way back in the day, and still, to a certain degree, is how I feel. Now, there are other motivations, but I keep those primary motivations out there in mind when I'm interacting with other people, especially people I don't really know all that well in the podcasting space. Each one of those types of people I mentioned previously, they all have their own goals, their own wants, and their own needs. And I understand bits and pieces of all of them. But I constantly need to remind myself that some people, podcasting is truly an act of empowerment. Empowered podcasters have their own motivations that I, from my position of privilege, I can understand them, but I'm also an egotistical narcissist. Those are true statements about me, which I try and tamp down as much as possible. But because of that, I honestly have a tough time relating to the people who podcast because of the empowerment factors. And I think I can do better. In fact, I think we all can do better acknowledging the empowering capabilities of podcasting. We can do better accepting that empowerment is a valid reason to podcast and then not foist any of our own baggage upon them or pile up our own assumptions on those who podcast for that very reason. And I also think we can do better at enabling those who podcast, not only because it's fun or an art form or a job or a path to riches, but because it gives them a voice, a sense of worth, a way to do something beyond the limitations of their own circumstances. We can start by asking a new question. When we meet a new podcaster, especially someone who may be shy and not as outgoing and egregious, if that's a word I'm looking for, as we are, instead of asking the question, so why do you podcast, or what do you podcast about? Instead of asking why do you podcast, I think we can ask them, how does podcasting make you feel? Because while I know that when I do feel empowered when I podcast, yes, I get it. And I'm betting that you too, to a certain degree, a large degree or a small degree, also feel empowered when you podcast. My first response if someone asks me how I feel when I podcast wouldn't be empowered. No. And it might not be yours either. But for someone else, It might be. Now, maybe they don't come out and say, I podcast because I feel empowered, but they would likely use some words that would clearly point to a completely different primary motivation than you have, a different motivation than I have. I think we should all work to ensure that podcasting remains a way, not the only way, but remains a way that people can find a sense of empowerment in their lives. More to the point, I think that they deserve our support along their journey to discover exactly where that empowerment might take them. We can do our part, not to try to force them to podcast the way that we do, which is my big problem, but to listen and support, encourage, and even celebrate their successes, however they define them. Let's make all of podcasting better by also being better podcasters to other podcasters, shall we? Speaking of things we shall do, a quick Boostagram corner.
Now it's time for the Boostagram corner.
Boostagram corner. I don't know a thing about crypto.
Big thanks to York Campbell of Poetic Earthlings. You might have heard York previously. He has done a guest version of Podcast Pontification while I was on break last year. York bought me a virtual coffee and sent the following note. Thank you, Evo, for making podcasting more thoughtful. Well, you are welcome, York, and I hope you're thinking that today's episode is also somewhat thoughtful. Last thing is sponsorship deals. Have you noticed we've got my podcast reviews? Thank you very much, Daniel J. Lewis, sponsoring Podcast Pontifications this month. There are still opportunities for sponsorship for 2021, and I'm starting to book into 2022 now. I know, crazy. And by the way, these are not ads. These are not ads. I'm not running ads on the program. I offer sponsorship. Only services that are of relevance to working podcasters that I genuinely feel will make podcasting better can sponsor the show. Yeah. Now, there are also some opportunities for Podcast Pontifications to showcase your podcast if you'd like to do that. Go to podcastpontifications.com/sponsor if that's interesting to you. And with that, have a fantastic weekend. No episodes from me on Friday, as you know, but I shall be back on Monday with yet another Podcast Pontifications. Cheers.